Have you ever heard the name Charles Guiteau? Madman. After feuding with several defense attorneys, life story gets weirder and weirder and weirder. Madman. Hello, dear audience. Raise your hands. Have you ever heard the name Charles Guiteau? Do you know who he was and what he did? If not, you're not alone.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well Hung History, where we tell true tales of the condemned and the executed. We'll also talk a little bit about the various methods and devices of execution that have been deployed throughout time. I'm your host, Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us.
Today's topic is Charles Guiteau, the assassin of the American President James Garfield. So come join us on this roller coaster as we learn more about this mysterious, murderous madman. Charles Julius Guiteau, 1841 to 1882. He was born in northern Illinois to Jane and Luther Guiteau, and his family, at least his father, was of French Huguenot extraction. He had 5 siblings, and he was somewhere in the middle. His mother died young, and he moved around the Midwest with the living members of his family. Young Charles appears to have been a particularly terrible student, and he struggles at various schools with poor marks and uneven attendance. Despite this, he tries and predictably fails to gain entrance to the University of Michigan. Now, there's nothing wrong there, not the first nor the last, to get a rejection slip from that vaunted institution. While that's not very noteworthy so far, trust me, this is where any semblance of normalcy ends, and his life story gets weirder and weirder and weirder as it goes on. While still in Ann Arbor, and still with the vain hopes, I guess, to get into the Big Blue, he received some curious correspondence from his father. Old Dad informs his son that he's joined the notorious Oneida community in upstate New York, founded and led by the even more notorious John Humphrey Noyes. Now, we won't get into any great detail here about Noyes, nor his free love cult at Oneida there, but I encourage you to check out another podcast that we're doing called Lost and Unfound, where we will be dedicating an entire episode to this topic. So if this has piqued your interest, please look for that one, as it should be dropping soon. Well, the young Guiteau seems to be even more enamored with the infamous John Noyes, even more so than his dad, and he's soon on the love train to Oneida. He eventually would be resident at the commune, off and on, for at least the next 5 years. But even in the most eccentric and accepting place, he just can't fit in what was the 19th century equivalent, I guess, of a late 20th century New York City bathhouse or modern-day swingers club. He is repeatedly rejected and ostracized. In fact, even the freakiest of the freaks reportedly joked about his surname, calling him Charles Get Out rather than Charles Guiteau. Despite this rejection, he briefly heads off to Hoboken, and he launches a newspaper called The Daily Theocrat. I'm going to say it again, The Daily Theocrat. And this newspaper espoused the Noyes. Now, this is a brilliant business plan. Go to New Jersey and preach the gospel of free love and group marriage to the masses. Well, not only is this one of the worst marketing ideas in history, it's also a testament to the madness that seems to be boiling within him. Eventually, he turns on Noyes and pursues several lawsuits against him and also the community that had shunned him. These, of course, go nowhere. And in fact, his dad, who after all encouraged his son to join Oneida, wrote several letters in support of Noyes, and he resigned himself to the reality that his wayward son was, quote, irresponsible and insane. That's an understatement, by the way. He heads off to Chicago next and becomes a bill collector at a law firm there, where he engages in nefarious practices, and he pockets the fees that were due to his clients. While in the Windy City, he marries a librarian named Annie Bunn in 1869. But under pressure of the law and angry clients, they're on the road again in 1872, and this time to New York City. This is where he gets specifically interested in national politics and becomes a keen supporter of the enigmatic Horace Greeley in his failed attempt to unseat the incumbent president, Ulysses S. Grant. Greeley gets trounced in the polls, but not before Guiteau delivers a speech to virtually no one in which he claims that the challenger, that being Greeley, promises him the ambassadorship to Chile if he were to be elected. After accusations of physical abuse and infidelity, Annie divorces the would-be ambassador soon after. And at this point, Guiteau writes, and writes being the operative word, a book called The Truth in 1875, which was essentially a total plagiarism of John Noy's lectures. He spends the next few years wandering the country as a sort of itinerant, self-proclaimed prophet, preaching to an audience of a few people, and that's on a good day. Well, now it's 1880, and James Garfield had become nominated as the Republican presidential candidate. And this followed a contentious convention in New York, which Guiteau himself had attended. Garfield would soon go on to win the presidency, but it was a tight race. Charles tells himself that he's responsible for Garfield's win over the Democratic candidate, Winfield Scott Hancock, and so he petitions the future president for high diplomatic posts to either Vienna or Paris. And he's laughed out of the room. Now he follows the new Garfield team to D.C., and he's essentially homeless, and he spends his days as a stalker, basically, haranguing officials for an imaginary diplomatic post that would never come. He's just a total nuisance. At one point, he has an incidental encounter with the newly minted Secretary of State, James Blaine, who shouts at him, quote, "Never speak to me again on the Paris consulship as long as you live." And this would become a recurring theme. Well, this seems to have been the last straw in rejection to a man who had spent his life being rejected, and he decides he has no other choice than to assassinate the new president. Why does he choose to direct such hatred and animus towards Garfield, whom he supported and he had stumped for just months before? This is confusing. Well, everything with Charlie is confusing. The most likely explanation is that after being ignored time and time again for posts that he was neither qualified for nor never considered, his delusions of grandeur just simply turned into madness and then into murder. He argues to himself in his ramblings that Chester Arthur, now the vice president, is the right man for the top job. And so he's decided that he must assassinate Garfield so as to make Arthur the president. And then Charles would be granted the prominent roles that he felt he was owed. Okay, see how this is going? He worships John Noyes, and then he sues him. He worships James Garfield and will soon kill him. He worships James Blaine and Chester Arthur, and then he turns on them. And it's likely that none of these prominent figures had ever really even heard of his name. Well, now it's time to exact revenge on President Garfield, and he seems to have vacillated between a knife and a revolver. And despite no prior experience with firearms, he chooses the latter. On July 2nd of 1881, he hunts him down at some railroad tracks in Washington, where Garfield was giving a kiss goodbye to his wife, Lucretia. And Guiteau shoots Garfield point blank twice in the back, and he shouts, quote, "I am the stalwart of stalwarts. Arthur is president now." The president is seriously wounded in this attack, and Guiteau is arrested at the scene without incident. Garfield would languish on for almost 3 more months before ultimately succumbing to his wounds on September 19th of the same year. Despite his eventual death, surgeons and medical experts at the time and now have cited malfeasance in the president's medical care. Most have concluded that the injuries that he sustained were not mortal ones. In fact, a recent evaluation suggests that if this assault were to happen today, Garfield would have been released from the hospital within a week. As for Guiteau, he languishes in jail during this intervening period, and he's accused of attempted murder and then of capital murder, following Garfield's last mortal breath. Like John Wilkes Booth, whom we've followed here, Charlie considered himself a martyr, and he seemed to have no concept as to the extent of the hatred that was directed at him from probably all of the population. His trial takes place beginning in November of 1881, and though he demanded to represent himself, he was not allowed to do so, and this was based on his precarious mental capacity. And after feuding with several defense attorneys appointed to represent him, finally a lawyer named George Scoville was essentially forced to argue his case. And a footnote here, Scoville was the husband of one of Guiteau's sisters. So now he's resorting to nepotism, or at least the courts are. The trial was one of the first in the United States that raised the issue of guilt by reason of insanity. And I think that's in order. Though Guiteau attests to his sanity, and I think we all know that's not true, his own defense attorney, his own brother-in-law, brings in a so-called alienist, aka psychiatrist. This proto-shrink's name was Edward Spitzka, and he said, quote, "He is not only now insane, he was never anything else. He also called him a, quote, moral monstrosity. So keep in mind, this is the defense. You got to admit, this is a highly unusual defense on so many fronts. And all the while, the assassin seems to alternate between agitation and disputation with his own counsel as well as his grandiosity towards the jurors. During the trial, the shenanigans rage on, and he blames the doctors for killing Garfield. He blames the new president, Chester Arthur. I thought that was his old friend. And he recites poems and he rambles incoherently. And sometimes he dances as he was led in and out of the courtroom. He also shares the details of his tragic and bizarre life with a reporter at the New York Herald. And he finishes with a sort of 19th century Tinder post. And he says that he's looking for a, quote, nice Christian lady under 30 years of age. Well, on January 25th, 1882, the inevitable sentence of death is handed down, and our mad bard responds by shouting obscenities at the jurors, and he says, quote, "You are all low, consummate jackasses." He keeps mumbling and writing and ranting until the day of reckoning, which took place on June 30th of 1882. But he was not led to the gallows. He reportedly danced to the gallows, and he smiled at the witnesses, and he shook hands with his executioner. And on the way to his last dance, he read a poem that he claimed he had written earlier in the morning called, quote, "I am going to the Lordy." And he was said to sing it in a sort of falsetto, maybe in a childlike voice. And he asked that an orchestra accompany him. But for one final time, this request was not granted. And now we will perform this poem here.
I am going to the Lordy. I am so glad I am going to the Lordy. I am so glad. I am going to the Lordy. Glory, hallelujah, glory, hallelujah. I am going to the Lordy. I love the Lordy with all my soul. Glory, hallelujah. And that is the reason I am going to the Lord. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. I am going to the Lord. I saved my party and my land. Glory, hallelujah. But they have murdered me for it. And that is the reason I am going to the Lordy. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. I am going to the Lordy. I wonder what I will do when I get to the Lordy. I guess that I will weep no more when I get to the Lordy. Glory, hallelujah. I wonder what I will see when I get to the Lordy. I expect to see most splendid things beyond all earthly conception. When I am with the Lordy, glory, hallelujah, I am with the Lord.
I apologize for my horrible singing voice, but if you're interested in this, you can check out Stephen Sondheim's great play, Assassins. This is a Broadway show, and this was actually featured in that show. Well, I've read it, I've sung it, and you can too, but it ain't Shakespeare, I promise you. The drop killed him instantly. His body was sent for anatomical analysis, and if you find yourself in Philadelphia, you can examine Guiteau's deranged brain, which is housed in a jar at the Mutter Museum.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.